Hello everyone, and welcome to this session on unions and a basic income, hosted by the fabulous folks at UBI Lab Manchester, part of the UBI Lab Network, a non-partisan campaign group working to make UBI happen. My name is Maddie Ratcliffe. I'm Campaigns Manager at the Musicians Union, and I will be your guide for this evening. Before we start, some usual housekeeping type rules. The event is being recorded. You can have your cameras switched off or on. That is entirely up to you. Questions, please do not wait to ask questions. If you do have a question, pop it in the chat as we go. If you can put question in capital letters at the start of your question, that'll be a great signpost to Louis, who will be in the chat looking for questions and signposting them to me. And we're going to try and make sure we get through as many questions as possible and make this as discursive a session as we can. And we also invite you to share your thoughts in the chat as we go as well. We don't have much time to tackle this big, complex and vital issue. I think 30-40 minutes for a chat and a bit of a Q&A is not much time to kind of get into it completely, but we're going to give it a go. And it's important in that time that we have to keep things kind, compassionate, inclusive, and really focused on unions and a basic income. And if you have any issues during the event, technical issues or anything else, just send a direct message to Louis for support via the chat. So, UBI, we are starting with the definition of UBI as an unconditional monthly sum paid to everyone to act as a basic income alongside work. Any UBI should be equal, should be simple, democratic and inclusive. And a fuller definition of all of those values will be shared in the chat this evening, which gets me to my favourite bit. Joining us on the panel today are John McDonnell, MP, who is hot-footed here from a very important event in Parliament. John is Labour MP for Leeds and Harlington since 1997 and former Shadow Chancellor from 2015 to 2020, and it is an honour to have him here. Also on the panel is Balraj Samrai, a musician, facilitator and youth worker from the Midlands. Balraj has been based in Manchester for over 15 years, working in both the music and education sectors. He is also on the Musicians Union North of England Committee and co-chair of our Climate Action Group. Vicky is also on the panel. Vicky Blake is from Leeds University. Vicky is currently on the University and College Union NEC and is a former UCU president. Finally, we have Jonathan Rhys Williams, lawyer at GMB Wales and South West, co-founder of UBI Lab Wales, and he's on the technical advisory group for the Welsh Government Basic Income Pilot. So lots of people with lots of knowledge and incredible brains to pick. With that, let's get straight to it. Our first question for today's panel is, what's the #1 reason that you think a trade union should support a universal basic income? And if we start with John.
I think it's straightforward, really. There's a deep in the heart of trade unionism from the very beginning is about how we ensure that working people have a decent living standard. Part of that is, of course, how trade unions negotiate and represent their members at work to get a decent wage. But also, as time has gone on, the trade union movement developed. It's also been about making sure that everyone within society, whether they're in work or out of work, have the basics of having a decent quality of life. UBI at the right level and introduced in the right way can actually achieve that. And so, in addition to that, we've also argued time and time again that having a UBI gives people immense amount of freedom. And often that freedom is linked with the trade union activity as well. So, for example, we've had case after case in recent years in particular, where employers have been able to effectively almost starve people back to work when there's a dispute because they have no income. And in addition to that, the Tories changed the law so that people couldn't fall back on social security benefits when they're in dispute as they did in the past. And so therefore UBI gives that ability to have a basis, a foundation upon which, if one withdraws one labour, you're not directly implicated into poverty or your family as well. So I think that it's sort of essential to the way in which the history of the trade union movement objectives has been developed over the last 2 centuries. I think it's at the core of trade unionism.
Fabulous, thank you. I love that point about empowering union workers to take action. Balraj, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what John just kind of tackled there as well. I think there was a motion at conference last year for Musicians Union Conference about carers, which kind of came to mind. And I think often musicians don't always have that same access and equity, and to be able to create, experiment, perform without jeopardy. So carers or people with a lot of domestic kind of household work or chronic health conditions may not always have the same kind of access, or may suddenly have to cancel shows, things like COVID. You're not necessarily protected. A lot of musicians and young musicians as well kind of were left out there as well. So I think it just gives that kind of basic right, as well as John was saying, that you don't have to worry about, if you're having trouble with work, when you have issues like a dispute, you can withdraw that labour, I think, as well, which I think is really, really important. And I think it would involve almost having better working relationships and working rights with employers, I think, as well, people who are employing musicians. So I think all round it's a big win, I think.
And there'll be a lot in common there, I think, with kind of lecturers and people working in the university and colleges. So if we go to Vicky and then Jonathan.
Thanks, Maddie. So it's really hard to answer the question with one thing, but what I kept coming back to was that when everything is going well and when a union is functioning the way it should be, when it's democratic and it's representing its members, a union has a role as part of the fabric of a humane, functioning society. And this is a conversation about equity and care and access to a life for everyone where everyone can flourish, that unions have to be a part of. And I think that, there's going to be a lot of time that we spend talking about potential critiques and existing critiques and the evidence base for UBI in the rest of this meeting. But fundamentally, it's a conversation that trade unions need to be a part of. There are the practical and political aspects. It's an idea that's not going away. And I quite liked the framing of it as a patchwork of possibilities in a report I read from, I think it was Public Services International. And I like the idea of a patchwork because a patchwork is something that we can work on together. And it's something that where you can bring ideas together and we can respond to concerns and we can develop how we preempt and react to them. And I think the points that others have made already just now speak to that, because we are in a situation where we see increasing precarity and increasing demand, not only from employers, but also from a lot of our political figures, that we should be accepting of this new world where it is also precarious. And I think we should absolutely not accept that, and that being part of this conversation, I would say about universal basic services as well as about universal basic income, is just something that we owe to our members, because we owe it to society to be having this conversation, to be developing the evidence base as best we can. And who better to be part of that conversation than unions who have got so much experience directly representing people in the workplace and also people who are forced to exit the workplace for a number of reasons. So yeah, that's my, not really one thing, one reason.
Yeah, I think it is difficult to say just one thing. I mean, for me, there are a number of reasons. I think they've all been touched on, really. The joys of going last, I suppose, with a question. But certainly, precarious work is absolutely one of them. I think strengthening of collective bargaining is something that I think a UBI would certainly improve. People's ability to say no to low paid work, the ability to join the picket line. And with that, of course, the saving, I think, that unions would get with their strike funds, because they might not necessarily have to pay out as much money for people joining a picket line. So I think, and of course, it's not a secret that unions have been in decline for a number of years. And so, if you can make that cost saving through a UBI by not having to put, and therefore not having to pay out with a strike fund, then those resources can be put to better use somewhere else. So I think, in terms of industrial action, I think UBI could be a game changer. And we've seen what happened, last year. There was a renaissance of unions almost last year, when there was the R&T were leading industrial action, and there was a real wave of excitement on the left. And I think, a UBI could, if those people that were out there on the picket line had a UBI, they might have been able to stay out on the picket line for a bit longer, improve those demands, or get the demands rather that they were asking for. And so, yeah, I think it's a win-win for unions, and I think at some point they will come around to the idea, but it's like for people like us to really convince them to do that.
So given we talked about so many benefits to the union movement, we've talked about stopping employers starving people back to work, we've talked about it as a patchwork of possibilities, strengthening collective bargaining, saving on strike funds, and actually being a game changer for industrial action. Why do you think that unions are not supporting a universal basic income at the minute, or why so few unions are supporting it? And what do you think the challenges to supporting it might be? So if we go the same order and start with John again.
I'll be a bit anecdotal, shall I, on this one. It's just the experience of coming up against some of the arguments that this from trade unions, some trade unions, that this is not for us. Ages ago, before I was Chancellor, I was hosting a series of events in Parliament called People's Parliament, where I was getting different people coming in who'd written or developed a project and a radical project, talking about their ideas. And one of the people I brought in was Guy Standing. And eventually he became advisor to me when I was Shadow Chancellor. And Guy, at that point, was developing his book about universal basic income. And we invited a number of trade unions into the discussion. And it's quite interesting, the division that there was. There were some trade unions who really went for it and saw this as part of their role, if you like, in terms of protecting their members and giving their members security. But actually, that wider role of trade unions, which is in many of their constitutions about transforming society, bringing security to everybody. And as Vicky says, and that's often about universal basic services, but alongside that, here's a way of making sure we have a universality of security of income. But there was another group, and it's quite interesting, and I won't name names, it's embarrassing, but there was another group who were basically saying, actually, you're undermining the role of trade unions by doing this, because our main role is hard negotiations around wages. And this is the anecdote. It reminded me, when I was a youngster, I worked, first of all, for the National Union of Mine Workers, and I worked for the TUC in the Social Insurance Department. We had the same tussle over child benefit, because the argument was put then that actually it will introduce a free benefit like that to everybody, and you'll start undermining our ability as trade unions in negotiating, because you'll have this benefit not negotiated by us, not delivered by us, etc. And it's interesting, the Child Poverty Action Group did a lot of work. That was in the 70s into the 80s. And actually, at the end of the day, it was the TUC. They never got sufficient congratulations for this. It was TUC under a guy who headed my department, Peter Jakes, and the General Secretary of the TUC at the time was Len Murray. And they said, no, actually, the role of trade unions is much wider than pure economistic demands like that. It is about the society that we want to create. And at that point in time, believe it or not, the TUC was virtually in government, because they were access to number 10. They had a whole range of powers and involved in different policy-making developments. And I saw the introduction of child benefit, a universal benefit going to everybody. It was almost like a prototype of what you could develop on in the future. And so it was breaking this narrow economistic view of trade unionism, that they just had to represent their members. It was more than that. Some argued, well, if you do that, there'll be no incentive to join a trade union. Quite the reverse. It strengthened the argument joining a trade union will benefit you in more ways than just the negotiation around your wages. So I think that's the argument that we've got to confront. There's still people out there who see the UBI as undermining the trade union role. I think it actually strengthens it.
You won't hear any disagreement from us. Balraj.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me because I guess my union, they are supporting it at the moment, which is really, really great to be a part of. And I think, as I maybe mentioned before, because there is a lot of freelance work, and that means that there's maybe a lot more sort of jeopardy that we face sometimes. So I think it really would make a lot of sense in our case, really, as musicians, to be supported. And I think especially around COVID and people getting left out of various kind of schemes sometimes as well, and not being able to access maybe the same kind of level of support. So I think some of the reasons though, or the reason I was just thinking about really is sometimes I do think there's that element of and this sometimes comes up in some meetings of my own as well, around, do we just support our members and are we just there to represent our members, or is it beyond that? Is it kind of like wider solidarity movements? Is it wider kind of showing that we are connected in with one another, really? And for me it feels like something that could be like a radical future that could be possible. And I think you don't know unless you give it a try as well. You might have to work out a few kind of nuts and bolts and things as well, but I think it'd be kind of quite a revelationary thing to give a go, I think.
Just to pick up on one element is the idea of, like, with unions, of saying the quiet bit out loud, right? Where trade union power comes from its membership and comes from growth, and that gives us our mandate. That kind of democratic element so important, and where we give voice to freelancers as well, like included in that. I think particularly important ones to raise. Vicky, do you want to pick up from that?
I'll try. I was just thinking about the barriers question, like stripped down a bit. And I think that within a lot of trade unions, there are barriers to even having these conversations that need to be had in a really in-depth, exploratory way. And I should have said at the beginning, as far as I can see from our policy base and also from my memory of being involved in UCU very heavily for the last 15 years, we don't have a sort of very specific piece of agreed policy on this. We've talked about sort of issues around the edge of UBI, but we haven't had a big debate about it. And I think that some of the barriers to having the conversations are the sort of structural ones about how busy we are firefighting all the other issues that we're talking about here this evening. And that intersects with the points that John was making about, the traditional framing of a union and how its bargaining power is conceived of and how that operates. But I think that how our unions function, how our democracies and hierarchies within our unions work, needs an overhaul in many ways. And at the same time, we need to be confronting the issues that are facing our whole society. And to do that, we have to be also thinking about issues like UBI. We have to be confronting not only the potential benefits, but also the critiques that are there and do need to be dealt with, remembering that UBI doesn't have one fixed definition or model, and that the evidence base, as I was saying before, is not what we would like it to be, perhaps. So we need to confront the dismantling and destruction of public services. And there's an important set of conversations, and I think I would say negotiations, to navigate about how we build a more democratic and equitable society, being more alive to those criticisms, but also in that process, making the case and making the argument for the role and the value of a trade union. And, being realistic, this is also pessimistic, I suppose, depending on how you choose to look at it, but we aren't likely to be implementing a model of UBI anytime soon that effectively erases the need or impetus for people en masse to work. So we need to be having conversations about how it can operate within society and how it can, and at the moment, I honestly think the biggest barrier to unions getting on board with this is that we're not necessarily even having the conversations, or where they are raised, the dismissing of the conversation happens on quite a surface level, where actually what we need to go do is go more deeply into it. I hope that makes sense. Made sense in my head.
Yeah, I just want to, I suppose, touch on something John mentioned. I think unions really are at their, I think this is what you're getting at, John, is that unions are at their best when they are advocating for transformational policies. And you look at some of the policies unions have got behind. I mean, a 2-day weekend, 8-hour working day, paid maternity leave, workplace pensions, paid holidays, equality laws, overtime pay, workplace health and safety laws. I mean, the list goes on. And I think the issue, perhaps at the moment at least, is that I think trade unions have become sort of almost too focused on collective bargaining issues in the workplace and not really thought about the bigger picture anymore. And because of that, they can't then see how this would essentially benefit those fights that they're having in the workplace, because of course by implementing UBI you've got people who are far more willing to lose pay and go on strike and that kind of thing. So I think those, that's where we need to move trade unions to. And I think that's the problem, is they're not thinking about the bigger picture as much as they should be anymore, whereas they used to think much bigger and much more transformationally. I think in addition to that, however, there is a fear that by implementing a UBI that it'll have an impact on people joining the trade union, because people might not think necessarily that they need to be a part of a trade union anymore. And also I think this is a generational thing, perhaps, is that I think a lot of trade unions and their leaders associate work with people's sense of identity. And I think that by implementing a UBI and people not necessarily having a fixed career because of a UBI, there's people will lose that sense of identity, and that's what's important to a lot of, I think, trade unionists as well. So yeah, I suppose that would be my answer to your question, Maddie.
So just picking up on that, and maybe we start with Jonathan, especially when you're talking about identity as well. What do you think it would take to get the kind of those people that you encounter in the trade union movement, the people that we're talking to, the people that I think a lot of us here in this room want to reach? What do you think will get them moving towards UBI, or a place where they can support UBI?
Well, I think ultimately trade unions are democratic institutions, so I think in order to bring, the leadership and those who have, the loudest voice in the trade union on board with these kinds of things, and the profile as well to push the policy within the trade union movement, you need to get the membership on board with it. And I think that is that's done on a grassroots level. You're talking to your branches and that kind of thing about it. Introducing motions at Congress is another thing you can do, and sort of twisting their arm to take action, if you will, into, at least I think, from in terms of my trade union, and of course I'm not speaking on behalf of them today, but I don't think they've undertaken any research, for example, on what impact a UBI could have for the membership. So that kind of thing, if you put emotions down, asking them to do something, about it, like looking into how it could impact the membership, then I think that's how you bring them on board. But it's not going to be easy, and I think conversations like this are a good place to start.
With we had experience at a trade union conference, bringing a motion with our young members on a basic income, and you could sort of sense the palpable fear in the room about whether or not people should vote for it, and what can we do or tweak to kind of get them across the line, because that is that kind of idea and how you get them across the line. John, you were about to dive in there.
I was bubbling really, because just going on from what Jonathan said, we have to recognise the political economic environment that we've been in for a period. So after 14 years of austerity, you can understand what, particularly in this recent period with a cost of living crisis, wages being held back, although they're picking up a bit now, you can understand why the trade unions have said, look, we'll just want to focus on getting the income side of it sorted out, our negotiations, getting wages sorted. So you can understand why there's been that focus of attention. And also, I have to admit as well, after Irish had a Chancellor for 5 years, and it was a period in where lots of ideas were bubbling up, and UBI it was in our manifesto to give a commitment in 17 and 19 about a pilot, so we could then start demonstrating how it could work and how we could win the argument and bring people over and all the rest of it. But since after losing the election in 19, there's been a bit of burnout amongst the movement and some people as well about discussing large-scale transformative politics at the moment. That will come back. That will come back. And I think I can understand why the unions are focused on wages. I can understand why there's that element of burnout post 2019. But Labour are going to be in government I think, by October, November. They're not saying an awful lot at the moment before the election. We'll see what their manifesto says. But whatever happens after that election, I think there'll be a huge amount of pressure on them to deal with the problems that people face. And at the moment, from the policies that we've seen so far, they're quite limited. And therefore, I think our job now is to get policies on the shelf so that when they recognize they need more radical solutions, or when people are pressing again in a new political climate for more transformative policies for society, this one is on the shelf ready to have that discussion and debate. But it means over the next 6 months and then I think into the first 18 months of a Labour government, it is that hard slog of just having practical discussions about what it would mean for individual communities, what it would mean for workers in particular sectors. And Balraj, the issue around for example, musicians is a really good example about how it provides the basis for a creation of real fertility of creativity where people can fall back on the UBI when they're in and out of unpaid work, that sort of thing. They maintain their input, if you like, into the cultural life of the country. All of those issues, I think, it's almost like micro discussions that need to be taking place. And I think that puts a responsibility on all our shoulders. And this is where our Catholic guilt comes out. It's making sure that, we're all working through a strategy with individual unions, if you like, and how you can bring people together. One of the areas has already been mentioned by Vicky. We've got a precariat out there that actually UBI is a solution to a certain extent, alongside unionisation. And the other issue as well, alongside the employment new deal, trade union new deal that Labour is going to be introducing, they say in their first 100 days, we can situate the UBI discussion in that discussion of that legislation going through. So I think I'm quite optimistic there's real opportunities of opening up the debate again in a way that we've been held back from because of the economic and political reality of the last few years and this focus on just getting through, not just COVID, but getting through the cost of living crisis.
I think that's right. So it sounds like now is a really good time for grassroots union members to start getting those motions passed at branch level, at conferences, so forth, to make sure that we're in a space where we can have that conversation. Vicky, you talked about kind of challenging some of the internal barriers within unions. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think actually what John has just said and kind of what others have been talking about, and I was thinking about Jonathan's points earlier about the ways that unions have been having conversations about things like parental leave and so on. There's a space in any miserable situation for optimism. And I think the original question was, what do you think will get unions to move towards UBI? And I think there's a couple of things that need to be said here. One is that we need to create space for optimism by creating space for possibility. So I absolutely agree that this is a time to be having these conversations and a chance to develop policy and to structure a conversation that can be had in a really practical way. There is so much precarity. I mean, so within post-16 education, we have a highly casualised section of our workforce in further education, higher education, prison, and especially actually in adult and community education. We have people scraping together. I was talking about patchworks earlier, patchworks of contracts for an income. And it ends up that the pipeline into this sector becomes much more accessible to those who've got independent means. So you can obviously see the argument there for UBI as kind of facilitating a more equitable education sector. And then that in itself, I work in widening participation. I know that the people that you encounter as your teachers and your tutors and the staff who run everything day to day in the organisations that's providing your education has an impact on students as well. But to try to go back to what will shift unions to move towards UBI, I think it is democratisation of our unions. I think it's about recognising the need to meet people where they are, which in many cases is extremely afraid, precarious and impoverished at the moment, and being interested in doing the work of policy discussions, research and exploration that goes beyond that kind of surface level engagement is fundamental to meeting people where they are. Because I don't just mean repeating back to people what they're telling you about how bad things are. I mean finding ways out of that situation into that vision that we've all got written into our trade union constitutions about a better society, a better world. So I think it, in a way, is about rediscovering what we're meant to be all about as trade unions, and that is the route to moving unions into this space.
And just to pick up on one of the questions in the chat about students and young people, I wonder, Balraj, what you think of how we bring in more young people into this conversation as well, with your work and background in youth work.
Yeah, there was a lot of things as well that I was just thinking about when Vicky and Jonathan were speaking. There was yeah, I think definitely looking at the way in which we can involve younger voices, and I think definitely thinking about our kind of, from the climate perspective, actually, I was just thinking, I'm on the climate emergency panel for the union, and looking at sort of the way in which actually having this kind of, I guess like a bit like with the 4-day week, or if people aren't all having to go out and work, and kind of actually that could be another sort of thing that people could look at that links, I think, to the objectives. So it also fits with, you know, people's Green New Deal kind of manifestos. I know that a lot of unions have taken up those kinds of policies and motions as well, and then looking towards a more ethical and sustainable kind of route, which I think is really championed by the youth. Also thinking about the way in which, say, like the unions, like the musicians union, we did a payment for £500, I think, for help musicians during COVID, which just really took people out of a really, really tricky situation. But I've also sat on the benevolent committee, and I've seen some really, really harrowing stories, actually, of people going through cost of living and all kinds of situations, and seeing that firsthand, and that this would just kind of put an end to that, really, and solve that kind of crisis that people are going through, to be able to actually start to, you know, look towards a better health, I think, overall as well, right? So I think it would actually improve people's health and mental health, physical health, and then potentially, you know, like I was saying here, like connect to the climate emergency. So I think there's a lot within there, and I think actually I liked what Vicky was touching on again around sort of the way in which people, maybe it could even choices that people have around work. Sometimes people may go towards slightly more harmful areas, not out of choice, but out of necessity sometimes. So I think there's also a link with maybe the kind of the policing and kind of prison industry as well, and how that kind of is involved in some of this as well, which I think is something that the young people I work with are quite passionate about as well, like from like an abolitionist sort of point of view, I think, as well. So a few things to get us moving on, hopefully.
Yeah.
I think it's worth asking John there, because one of the questions in the audience was talking about getting trade union leaders to talk about those necessary structural changes in order to mobilise them. So that kind of connection between a universal basic income and those big conversations that hopefully a next Labour government will be tackling: climate crisis, kind of prison reform, leasehold. I mean, there's so many kind of big substantial issues facing the UK at the minute. How do you think that we can kind of connect the two in a convincing way, or is it worth separating the two completely?
Yeah, I think it's worth integrating them all, but none of these changes, this is what we all say, isn't it? But it's true. None of these changes are going to be coming from the top. What we've got to do is, I think what will happen in the coming period, and it's already happening to a certain extent, is I think there'll be a whole range of social movement activity. A Labour government will come in, it's almost inevitable now. We don't know what sort of majority it's got. It will come in, and at the moment, on a relatively limited programme that in many fields, people at the moment feel may not be able to address a lot of the key issues that they're facing in their lives. So therefore, what's assembling at the moment is a whole range of sort of social movement campaigns. I convened a meeting of the whole range of disability groups with DPAC, Disabled People Against the Cuts, a few weeks ago. And it was a really amazing meeting. It was like the relaunch of a resistance movement. And what they were doing is, how do we campaign against the Tories, but then also how do we mobilise when Labour's in power to get our ideas across, and as a social movement, including a whole range of debates, discussions, and direct action if necessary. And I think that's happening in a whole range. It's just happening with regard to the environmental movement. So I think what we've got to try and do is insert this discussion into all of those social movement activities that in itself, I think, will create a climate of opinion that the incoming Labour government won't be able to ignore and maybe won't be able to resist either. And you can see where, in a number of those social movement campaigns, you can see where UBI comes in. What's interesting, in all those discussions that are taking place, it's come up in the chat as well. One of the key elements of those discussions, no matter what issue you're dealing with, it's a sort about social cohesion. What's the nature of the society we want to create and that we're living in at the moment? Because in many instances, it's a very divided, insecure society, and part of that division is caused by that insecurity. What UBI does, it brings the potential of security for a large number, economic security for a large number of people, that then gives them the freedom to have a different quality of life or different avenues of pursuing their life as well. So I think the way we go forward is to try and get, as those different issues are discussed and debates and social movements develop, we've got to insert ourselves into that discussion and put it into the discussions of those particular issues, exactly as Balraj says, as the environmental movement discussions are exactly a very good example. In addition to that, I do think if we come back to students, Vicky could help us on this in particular. It does need a discussion about particular sectors, and the education sector is one of them. And you can see my big concern in recent years, and I think Vicky's pointed this out when I've been on platforms, where access to beyond first degree into masters and PhDs and all the rest of it is almost become exclusive for people who can afford it, middle class in particular, because those who want to stay on and do PhDs, etc., just not only can't get the basic to survive on. They can just about raise the money to pay the fees, but they can't get the money to live, and the basic income would, and a universal basic income would open up that whole range of opportunities, particularly for working class young people. So I think looking at individual sectors and inserting ourselves into those campaigns would be absolutely key for us. It requires a fair amount of work, but as I say, I think there's enough people out there excited by UBI that could help us on that.
And just bringing it back to that kind of idea of structural change, I wonder, Jonathan, with your role on the technical group in Wales, informing that pilot, if you could talk a little bit about your experience of that and how perhaps how we can create space for kind of unions to be involved in that conversation.
Yeah, so I suppose just to give everyone a rundown of what the pilot is. So it's a basic income for care leavers. So for those people who are leaving the care system at the age of 18, essentially they were given £1,600 a month, worked out to around £1,200 after tax, for 2 years. So essentially the pilot has stopped now, so it's stopped taking on participants, so people will get it for 2 years. I think in total there were around about 500 people were on the pilot, and we're now in the evaluation stage. So the first report was released a few months ago, and the the results are really good. So Balraj touched on something really important earlier on, which is the impact it has on people's health. Now, it's not just this particular pilot that we've seen a significant improvement in physical and mental well-being, but if you look at all the pilots that have been undertaken, across the world, really, they all show that very trend, that there is a vast improvement on physical and mental well-being. And again, to touch on something that John was touching on, and something really, as someone who was, I was born a council estate, very working class, solicitor now, so I've worked my way up, if you will. But educational attainment is something that is really, really important, I think, to me in particular, because I saw a lot of my friends in school who could have gone on and done great things, but couldn't, afford to, or went into work instead. And hopefully what this pilot will show is that, those, in particular, this cohort of people as well, of course, they won't have some of the opportunities that a lot of people will have. They would have come from vulnerable backgrounds. And so, if it gives them the opportunity to go to university and stay on in further education, which some of the results are showing, then that's only a good thing, because, of course, those people are getting the opportunity that they wouldn't have had this basic income not being provided for them. In terms of how you get unions involved in the pilot, I think the first thing to say is that unions were offered an opportunity to join the technical advisory group, and it wasn't taken up, unfortunately. And I, of course, come from, so my role on the technical advisory group is not as a trade union, as an employee of a trade union. It's someone who lobbied the Welsh government to implement this pilot. But I think, in terms of Wales in particular, you would expect, I think, a lot more buy-in, I think, from trade unions, given that you already have a Labour government in place. But again, I think it just goes back to what we've been discussing previously. There is a skepticism with this, and I think perhaps what it's going to take is something like, a really positive evaluation study that shows that there are serious benefits. And, given that it's the first one in the UK to do it, maybe that's what it's going to take, is this evaluation study for a pilot in the UK that shows really positive results. And I think, if we've got something on a piece of paper that we can show to trade unions that works, then that's a really good start.
So just picking up a question from the chat from Margaret. Margaret asks, do we feel UBI delivers autonomy? And gives the example of women trapped in abusive relationships due to a lack of income. That was an issue that appeared during COVID and lockdowns as well. The TUC issued advice for reps to kind of support people who might be experiencing domestic violence. So how do we feel about UBI and autonomy, and how we bring that into a conversation about collective action? John?
I think UBI for me, it is all about freedom. It gives you that freedom of choice that you haven't had up until now, because you're trapped in so many different ways by the financial situation you're in. So I think it is about freedom, and I think that's a really good example. Can I give you another one? I chair a group, a national group that comes together of unpaid carers. If you're an unpaid carer and you're looking after someone with if you've got a family member you're looking after who's disabled, you're almost inevitably going to be living in poverty, because the allowance that you get is so little. But in addition to that, your world is completely narrowed by that lack of income, and you're terrified of the withdrawal of the benefit, that sort of thing. And also, it's a benefit. It's not as of right sharing of the wealth of the country, if you like, in that sense. And so there's a whole range of individual groups like that in society that are completely trapped in an existence that they don't want because of the lack of freedom, and that's purely because of the lack of the income itself. So I think it really is a way in which people can be free to have choices that they've never had before. And I just want to go back to the history of the trade union movement, because I think we need a narrative for trade unions that demonstrates that this is actually part of their history emerging. Trade unions were established to bring people together. You know, we discovered that secret in those small workshops and fields of solidarity, and solidarity works because you've got the strength through unity. You then negotiate in your employers better wages. Then it moved on to say, well, it's more than just wages, it's about society we have to change. So we enter into political activity, not just campaigning, but establishing a political party and all the rest of it. And then at that stage, because of I think the ideological debate that was going on, particularly around the insurance principle, I think we went down, not a cul-de-sac, but we went down a route that actually installed into our society, I think, what was in many ways quite an authoritarian approach to how people are supported. And so it was the benefits approach. Then actually the insurance principle, fine, but then associated alongside that was the benefits approach, where benefits were then used, one, to discipline, and then also associate stigma. And what UBI does, it lifts that all gone. You know, so I think what we're trying to say to the trade union movement, in your narrative of your history, you've developed from being organizations that simply negotiate wages into one organization form that's trying to transform society. You've delivered a system of lifting people out of poverty. Your next stage on now is to have a system where we've learned the lessons of that sort of national insurance benefit type approach, and we move on into a more refined system, which is about universal basic income, which establishes the freedoms and removes the insecurities that the trade union movement is all about. And I think if we develop that narrative, that this is just the next stage on of the history of the trade union movement, I think we can take people with us. And then when people throw up individual questions about how we fund it and all the rest, or how we tackle different individual pragmatic aspects of it, we can resolve those questions. And in fact, the funding issue straightforwardly, because right deep in the heart of trade unionism is the commitment to equality and redistribution of wealth. And that's how we would fund this. Does that make sense?
That does. I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to come in on that topic as well. Go on, Vicky.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to go back to well, the notion of freedom, but also to go back to what Balraj was talking about earlier with respect to engaging with younger people, making sure that younger people's voices and perspectives are within the conversations that we're having. And I think there's, I put a comment to this effect in the chat as well. I think there's an important set of conversations to be having about the impact that needing to earn money alongside your studies has on your ability not only to undertake those studies, not only to maximize every opportunity that there might be associated with studying, but also in the first place to even imagine that it's possible. And that, I think, connects that back to the issue of autonomy. And so the question, I think, was around, does UBI sort of provide or deliver autonomy? And I suppose the answer is not on its own, but delivered well, it has the potential to be really fundamentally making a difference there in removing barriers. So whether that's leaving an abusive situation, whether that is in terms of accessing education, whether it's to being able to provide care to someone that you love and care about at whatever stage of their life that they need it, to retrain, but fundamentally to be able to reimagine your future and respond to the circumstances that you find yourself in, while yet still having space for yourself, space to still be a person who can flourish within society. And I think that this is about a genuine concept of flexibility, which is counterposed to the sense in which employers often put it out there, you know, when they're talking about flexibility that's actually flexible exploitation. It's, you know, their falsified promises of the gig economy and 0 hours being really great for you. which I just fundamentally disagree with. And I think that is really important. It's looking at how UBI can maximise people's autonomy and opportunity that can counteract the sorts of approaches that can further entrench the stratification and bias that we're trying to push back against in society. And just speaking from the perspective of someone who works with students who are from around about 15 upwards, thinking about their future in schools. I'm based in a university, but I do that work. It is really hard to have conversations that are, you know, full of all the idealism that we like to think about in connection with education, when the reality is they're already working a part-time job to help support the family that they're part of. And when you then look at the situation that care leavers are put into when they leave, you know, the stuff that is statutory that's there for them, and they're put into a situation of having to learn how to survive at 16 up. There just isn't the level playing field that the sort of narratives that we often see in that space assume. So I think that's why this is so important to trade unions in general, but I think particularly education unions should be taking an interest in this conversation for that reason, because it's all about possibility.
And especially where 0 hours contracts are concerned, the barriers that being on a 0 hours contract places to kind of things that a lot of people will take for granted, and perhaps a lot of people in leadership positions and decision-making positions will take for granted, like the opportunity to have a credit card or know that you can pay the bills the next month, these kinds of privileges that we don't necessarily talk about out loud enough in the right places. So taking another question from the chat, how do we then specifically demonstrate to the union movement or to trade unions that a universal basic income brings something special to these issues? So, and what is it that only unions can do about them? And I will send that Jonathan's way.
What can unions do? I suppose what's in terms of what unions can bring to the table, and what's special about them in terms of advocating for a UBI, which I think is the question, right? Is that kind of the gist of it? Is the membership, I suppose. If you've got you know, the leadership of the trade union, the leaders of the trade union movement advocating this idea, you know, and telling their membership that it's a good thing, then ultimately I think, you know, the way in which that could then spread across society, because let's not forget, I think there's still 6 million members of a trade, 6 million people rather, that are members of a trade union in the UK. So if you've got trade unions that are advocating this idea, then it gets people talking about it. And I think, you know, if you're talking, when you talk about people, talk about UBI to people and explain really what it is, and I think people really have got a better understanding of it now. But I know that, you know, I've been following this idea for a good 10 years, right? And I remember I used to tell friends that there's this idea that you give money to people for nothing with no strings attached, and they just thought you were mad. But the idea has come along such a long way that now there is that sort of understanding, because you've got pilots and that kind of thing. But I think, you know, there is still a lot of people that don't really know what a UBI is and what the benefits are. And I think if you've got trade union leaders and people within the trade union movement that are advocating this idea, then ultimately that's a good thing. And the way in which that could spread, like I said, then I think is a positive thing. I think that's probably, to my mind at least, that I can think on the spot, is the special thing that a union could bring to this.
That's cool. And John, what kind of evidence do you think decision makers would want to hear that trade unions can provide, and that people in this room can start kind of bringing to the table?
Yeah, good point. I think what we should be doing, as I said before, look at individual sectors, see where their union membership are in terms of their living standards, the disputes they've entered into, how they've progressed on that. So it's very practical analysis, sector by sector of individual. Even to me, I think one good, I don't know what Jonathan thinks of this, but just an example of even in one firm, how would that affect people's lives in one particular firm, if you like, and what people think about it, and the support that they need to develop the idea as well. Because I think once we're demonstrating that what this will do to trade unions is that it will give their members sufficient security of income. It will enable them, therefore, to have a better quality of life, yes, but it certainly won't in any way undermine the negotiation about wages. As Vicky says, this is complementary to that role of the trade union movement itself. And then also, I think when you get into disputes, it does shift the balance of power, between employers and employees. It undoubtedly does. So I think the argument that we have at trade unions is about this just strengthens their hand in the workplace on a whole range of issues, not just about wages and all the rest. But I do think we have to sort of dive deep into individual sectors and individual operations, if you like, that are taking place, and union by union, convince them how relevant it is to them. Can I just throw one, again, anecdote? And Balraj, in terms of musicians, I was born in Liverpool, came from Liverpool originally as a kid and all the rest of it. They always look back upon why the Beatles and Mersey Beat developed is because actually a lot of them went to art school, then they were unemployed. But unemployment benefit wasn't brilliant, but it wasn't that bad. And also they weren't ruthlessly exploited and forced into work the way that they were now. And in many ways, lots of youngsters then, if they couldn't get work or they didn't get work of an income or whatever, at least they had an unemployment benefit, and they started developing their musical talent. And it's quite interesting how it freed up people's opportunities in that bizarre, almost contradictory way. And I think that's what this will do in our society. Lots of people will be free to develop, not just culturally, but also in other aspects of wealth, free to develop their own careers too, and also recognize the responsibilities that people have, particularly with regard to the family responsibilities that they undertake too. So I think there's such opportunities that we can develop bit by bit, pragmatically in sector after sector and in individual aspects of people's lives that this can benefit. And already, I think Jonathan mentioned it, all the evidence points to the improvement of people's health and mental well-being as well at the moment. And I think it is true, because I see it in my constituency. I do think we've got a mental health crisis at the moment. So all of those factors we need to bring together, because I think they're all relevant to trade unions representing their members and their interests that they have.
And picking up on what you said about musicians, for Balraj, I think this question, how do you think we involve kind of freelancers and creative workers in that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it was just making me think back as well around, I think, because I went through that period of time when there was things like EMA for young people, and then I didn't have to pay any tuition fees, and I actually got a grant. I think I was the last year to get a grant to go to uni, and I probably might not have gone now. So I think it's just kind of like, as we were saying before, how do we involve like the education unions, and like how do we get kind of people on board kind of with this? Because I think actually, so people are sort of seem to be organising at the moment as it is, young people, students, and it's kind of, I think it's on trade unions to kind of get on board with the demands and the young people, what they kind of, and it would increase their membership as well. That's something I was thinking about as well, was like, I think they're going to organise anyway. It's whether the union movement wants to kind of be there for those people, for those, those young creative people who are going to find a way. And if you can support them, they'll kind of probably value that union membership and be sort of members for life really as well, I feel like, and kind of, kind of keep the torch blazing, I guess, really. So I think, I'm just trying to get back to your actual question around it as well with freelancers and musicians. I think, it gives a lot of security, really, I think. And I think everything that was mentioned before as well around, just going back to that point, to do with people sort of faced with, say, like patriarchal harms and violence in their homes. But also there's sometimes young people who they don't have the same sort of privilege, I guess, around wealth, or maybe they do have income that they're sort of families can kind of give to them, but actually there might be it might be kind of conditional as well. So sometimes it does give people that kind of a little bit more autonomy, I think, which some people have been chatting about in the chat, I think, a lot as well, around how it creates you know, less divisive politics, I think, as well, for people, I think, as well, which I think and it looks like there's been studies getting shared around that as well, which I think it's kind of yeah, good to hear about, really. I think was it Dave that might have mentioned something about it as well in the chat, who's leaving now. But yeah, I hope that answers some of that, but I'm happy to elaborate more if needed.
There is more space to be creative as well, and like actually what you can do in that time that would be covered by a basic income as well. Just jumping to a question from the chat, Eleanor asked, and apologies about the pronunciation there if that was wrong, do you believe a basic income could build opportunities on top of the foundations of all our public services, i.e. create jobs and social value around them? And if we throw that to, oh, everyone's moved on my screen, to John and Vicky.
My view on others, I did an exercise during COVID when I brought together lots of people to talk about what sort of society do we want after COVID. And it was interesting. UBI was one of those debates that had so much support for it, but it was the point that Vicky made earlier. It was also around universal basic services as well. So it's not one or the other. One complements the other. And as a result of that, you can construct a society which provides those sort of essentials of life in a way that's secured for people. But the other issue that came in as well, which I thought was really interesting, is you can do that, but you've also got to build into that a process of democratic engagement and construction of those universal basic services, and also UBI itself and its role there. So it's always part and parcel. These two inroads are always part and parcel of democratizing society as well. And it is about redistribution of wealth. And Reinhardt has put in as well this concept, you know, getting across to people what we're doing is actually we're sharing the commons to enable us to have a better quality of life. But I think essential to it is ensuring that all of these systems that we develop, whether they're services or whether it's the development of a system by which people have a universal basic income, they've got to be under real democratic control and real engagement of how they're developed over time as well. Because a UBI being introduced won't be a static thing. There have to be a democratic debate about levels, about how it's rolled out, and also then obviously the funding aspects of it as well. And again, we had the debate about establishing a national wealth fund based upon some issues about how you draw resources from those that use the commons, and as a result of that, particularly land in particular, how you can then use those resources as the basis of a UBI introduced nationally. So I think they're the elements. Universal basic services, UBI complement one another, but the determination of them must be under democratic control, and there must be proper democratic engagement as they develop.
Vicky, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how to put this into words, because I think what we've come back to is one of the questions that you asked the panelists to think about in advance, which was around the concept of work and what is work as well. And so I'm also thinking about how UBI, that potential for UBI and services, you know, a development of universal basic services to be complementary to each other, and that vision of it being something, you know, riven through with democratic engagement, how that actually connects to how we conceive of what work is and how we put value on it. And I'm just trying to think of how to put this into words, because it's kind of all swimming around in my head a little bit. So at the moment, I'm very aware of the impact that COVID has had on a particular cohort of people, which is those of us who've ended up with long COVID and other disabilities as a result of COVID, and how much of a shock to the system that has been for many people, myself included, who, despite, you know, liking to think of myself as someone who was in solidarity with disabled community, I don't think you understand it until you start to experience it. And even within that space, I feel very lucky in the sense of I am able to work and so on. But it's really made me question how I conceive of myself, productivity culture and value and all of that kind of stuff. And if we were actually to be in a situation where we had UBI, we had that concurrent development of services, and we had that freedom and that space that we've been talking about, would we also be able to advocate for more respect and a kind of greater value being placed on the kinds of jobs that at the moment people are ending up doing that are not paid well, not even paid a proper living wage in many cases? And can we set people free a little bit from the shoulds and the shouldn'ts of that comes with all of that? And I do think that that also connects to the conversation we've been having about the gig economy and freelance and creative work as well. And this is the bit I'm struggling to express because it's kind of just come to me while we've been talking. But to give you an example of what it's like being in negotiations at sector level in higher education, I was in that space in 2019, 2020. We keep being asked to accept that there are exceptions to our objections to insecure work. That, of course, people who have other careers, for example, in the creative industries, for example, musicians who might do some tutoring at an institution of higher education, of course, those situations are okay to pay people in a really insecure manner, as if the very fact that this is somebody who is engaged in a creative industry makes the case when it doesn't, because we all need fundamentally to be valued and to be paid properly for the work that we do. And I just think that these conversations and the pilots that we need to be exploring about UBI help us to explode some of that, I'm trying not to swear, some of those myths that are perpetuated in those spaces, because it's really damaging. And I find that within the trade union space, actually quite often we're having to unpick those arguments that are presented to us by employers and often sometimes by politicians of certain stripes, and explain actually why no, that's not acceptable. This is not like a given that just some groups of people should expect to be more exploited than others. And that connects to the conversation that we've been having in the chat about unpaid carers as well, because that is work and that is work of value, because caring has value to our society. So yeah, I've kind of gone into that space that you go into when you're kind of thinking out loud. But I think that there is real opportunity here for a really progressive conversation. And I hope that that kind of brings it back round to the original question about the opportunities on top of the foundations.
Cool. I think Balraj popped his hand in the air there for a second. Balraj, do you want to come in?
I just had a thought as you were speaking there as well, Vicky, was that when we talk about these different models and when we're thinking about what is work and what is value and things as well. And so I'm currently working for an organisation part-time where, you know, we have unlimited leave and we have like a well-being allowance. So it's not quite UBI, but it kind of has a bit of that kind of function where if people, you know, aren't feeling up to it, or they've got a health you know, ailment or something is kind of stopping them from kind of coming in. And actually, you know, when you think about productivity and all these kinds of things, it doesn't really inhibit anything, because I think the other members of the team are just able to kind of come in and kind of take on different parts of things and support. And I don't think it hinders in any way. Do you know what I mean? So I know it's like a very anecdotal kind of example, but I think it's definitely been quite freeing to be in that kind of situation, I think, really. And I think the more of that kind of thing would be really, really beneficial. But also going back to say something I read from, you know, on the sign up from Dave around, you know, that we sometimes forget that, cooking food for families is work, isn't it? And also caring for people, and, you know, musicians like who are parents, like, you know, how do they get to gigs if there isn't that kind of support given for carers or musicians? So that I was really happy to see that I mentioned earlier at the last delegate conference in last summer, there was a motion passed to look to, you know, into caring support for musicians, freelancers, because so often that's not really kind of considered, whether it's childcare or being a carer. So I think, yeah, these are all kind of very much interlinked issues, I think, around disability justice, as much as anything else, I think links in here. So yeah, I just wanted to mention a point on that example, I guess, that I have. I think I really appreciate the point that was made earlier around the way, like migrant labor as well, and kind of that being sort of seen as being pitted against people, when people end up doing that work that people don't always want to do. And I think that would probably create a little bit more of a harmonious kind of setting, from in my opinion, I guess.
That's addressed a lot of points as well, and going back to that point about social cohesion. So before I throw to Alison to tell us a little bit about UBI Lab Manchester, I just wanted to invite John and Jonathan to share any final thoughts in the sort of the next minute, 2 minutes max.
Okay, very briefly from me. In the chat, Andy Burnham's pilot was mentioned. That was a real achievement. That was a huge achievement. It lifted my spirits to get, Andy inserting that into his manifesto. And I think as they develop, one of the things that we can try and do is, as those pilots are developed, to try and make sure we can try and deliver trade union engagement in them. I was concerned, as Jonathan said, in the Welsh one, it was difficult getting the unions involved. We need to learn some lessons about the approaches that we make in those individual unions. I think Andy's got the contacts with a whole range of unions because of his background and all the rest. And I think he'll want to build that in as well. So I think part of our role now is to, as these pilots emerge, and they keep on emerging, we try and make sure our role is to try and deliver trade union engagement and excitement about this as much as we can. I want to say one final thing as well. Years ago, when I was on the GLC, I funded Selma James and the Wages for Housework campaign and all the rest. They came out against the UBI on the basis that they thought it was undermining their campaign specifically for wages for housework. I actually don't think it does. I think it complements it as much as possible. So again, all those individual allies that are potentially out there, we need to understand where they're coming from and build them on board as much as we possibly can. Because what this does, as I keep saying, this frees up other aspects of people's lives, but it also complements that very almost traditional, I deserve a wage and I deserve a basic wage and my trade union will negotiate it for me. It complements all that role in a way. I think that will be to the benefit of everybody. I'll shut up at that point, Matthew. Okay.
No one wants you to shut up, John. I think just to add to that, it does complement in terms of it complementing things, and to say that, a UBI is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of our problems. It's a fantastic idea, but it will provide a foundation upon which to build on. And I think that's how it should be viewed. I think it's disappointing sometimes that, advocates of UBI and Universal Basic Services are butting heads when we should be advocating for both of those things. So I think that's an important point that I wanted to make. However, in addition to that, in terms of, while we're here, trade union engagement and that kind of thing, I'll just go back to what I said earlier. I think the way in which we get trade unions behind this is from a grassroots perspective. You have to have these conversations in your branches. You have to put motions forward to Congress, and you have to be pushing it. And as I said earlier on, it's not going to be easy, and it's probably going to be a long old slog. But I think, if we do that, then we will get there. And as soon as the trade unions are on board, then of course with their influence, hopefully, then you'll get the likes of the Labour Party on board as well. But yeah, that's it for me, I think.
Fabulous, thank you very much. So at this point, especially with regards to some of the developments in Manchester, I'd like to bring in Alison Hordale to talk about the UBI Lab there, their work, and how they're going to be taking this activity on unions going forward as well.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Maddie. So I'm Alison. I'm one of the co-chairs of UBI Lab Manchester, along with Louis, who's on the call, and Dave Beck, who I think went off and came on again at some point. We've had a great year in UBI Lab Manchester, and one of the great things we really do feel like we've had a massive input into is Andy Burnham putting it into his manifesto. I mean, it's amazing how much one paragraph in a manifesto, how thrilled you can get, and how much work it was. You know, we got people to talk to him from America on UBI and housing and so on. So what I'm thinking is this is really exciting. Thank you so much for all your input, all your ideas, all your questions. But it's going to be a huge piece of work, isn't it? Like Jonathan said, it's going to be a slog, because we're not, I mean, one of the things we're doing in Manchester, we've got our UBI Lab beer mats that we're giving out in pubs and things, which is great, but this is going to have to be much more getting deep down, like you said, deep dive into the unions. And we're going to need a lot of help for that, because we're not experts and there's only a few of us, and we don't have very much funding for paid work. So we need to have a really, really good discussion about how we're going to do this, how we're going to organise it. How can we support people and people like you to do this in your unions? So what is it we need? Do we need, draft motions? Do we need, we can organise people to come and give talks to people, for branch secretaries from the unions, whatever it is. We need to be looking at those real practical ideas of how we can take this forward, because otherwise we all know what, at the end of a meeting like this, we all go off and think, wait, that was great. And then it can all seep back into the sand. And I'd be really, really sad if that happened. I really want to gather all this enthusiasm, these ideas, and take it forward. So we're going to be sending out this video, and we're going to be sending out sort of call to action about, what can we do to help, and how can we spread this out? Because we only have a certain knowledge of the world of the unions, which is, why you've been talking and we haven't. So, yeah, thank you very much indeed. Is there anything anybody, would like to say about that on a very practical level, about how we can get the ball rolling on this project? Thank you.
And Alison, what's the best way for people to get in touch if they would like some information or support from the lab?
Louis, can you put the email address in the
sure.
Yeah, but if you go to the UBI Lab Network website, then you can join the UBI Lab Network if you want, and then we have a UBI and Unions subgroup on that, which you could be very, very welcome to become part of. But you can just directly get in contact with us, and we can have discussions on a sort of one-to-one basis about, do you want to organise an event like this? Would you like us to come along in person? Is there anybody you'd like to come and speak to your union? Is there anybody you'd like to help develop a motion with, or anything like that? There we are. Louise put it in the chat, info@ubilabmanchester.org. So I'm excited, but I'm also wanting to nail things down as well. So, yeah.
I think John said it perfectly when he talked about this is a real time for action and getting things nailed down, getting those policies in place, getting things ready, so that when the kind of starting gun goes off, we're ready to act. And with that, thank you, Alison. Thank you to all of our panelists, John, Balraj, Vicky and Jonathan. Your time is valuable. We are grateful that you chose to spend some of it with us. Thank you to everybody who joined at any part of the event today. If you're watching back online, we see you. Thank you very much for joining us as well. As Alison said, you can find out more about UBI Lab Manchester at ubilabmanchester.org, where you can also sign up for their newsletters and find them on socials. Any questions from musicians, you can contact me via the mu.org/contact. The recording of tonight's session should be on YouTube very, very soon with the UBI Labs. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Keep the chat going if there's anything you want to say, and we'll try and get back to you after this event. If not, have a great night.